everybody. Welcome to our next Zoom debate. I'm here with Forward columnists Ari Hoffman and Swanson. I'm Batya Ungar-Sargon. I'm the opinion editor of the Forward. And we're here to talk about an interesting topic today. So right now we're kind of in the bein hashmashos, in the in-between space between Yom Haatzmaut, which is a Memorial Day in Israel for fallen soldiers, and Yom Haatzmaut, which is Israeli Independence Day. And it's kind of this twilight time where Israelis are going from the kind of the sadness of remembering the fallen into the joy and the happiness of celebrating their Independence Day. But we were wondering, what does that mean for us in the diaspora? What does that mean for diaspora Jews? What should we be doing on Yom Haatzmaut? What is our role in that story? What is the role of Yom Haatzmaut, of Israeli Independence Day, in our story? When I was 11, I moved to Israel, and I moved back when I was an adult. And I remember the thing that I was so surprised about when I moved back here was when I was in Israel, Israelis don't think about us in the diaspora very much. And when I came back here, I remember being so shocked at how much American Jews think about Israel, how central Israel is to American Jewish identity. It was just shocking to come here as an adult, having not been here for a decade, and to realize that. And I still kind of don't really quite know what to make of that. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming to this conversation from. And I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about whether American Jews should be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut at all. Is that part of what it means to be part of the Jewish nation? Or is Yom Haatzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, a political position, a political day, one that really we shouldn't be celebrating? That's the question that our columnists are going to take on today, and we're really excited to have you here. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna take a poll. Actually, we're gonna ask you all, what do you think? Should American Jews be celebrating Israeli Independence Day or not? And after we take the poll, we're gonna see the results right away, and we're gonna talk about them. And then Ari and Joel are both gonna give a very short summary of their position. You'll be able to read more about that at the Forward tonight at 9 p.m. And then we're really going to try to take your questions. So there's a little Q&A box at the bottom, and we would really like you to engage. We're here, we're having a happy hour, we've got our drinks. We hope you have your drinks. So please tell us what you think. Tell us, do you think American Jews should be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut? Do you not think they should be? Is this question even heretical? How are you celebrating? We want to hear from you. We want to talk to you. We want to engage with you. So show up in that Q&A and let us know, by the way, if you're comfortable having your name mentioned, because we would love to give you a shout out. Okay, so without further ado, I'd say let's run the poll. So the question that we're asking here is, and the poll should show up in a minute in your Zoom. The question we're asking is, should American Jews be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut? Should American Jews celebrate Israeli Independence Day? So go ahead and vote. Let us know what you think. And we're going to take the poll again at the end, and we're going to see if Joel and Ari can change some minds here. Should American Jews celebrate Yom Haatzmaut? What do you think? And then as soon as you voted, we're going to take a look at those results. I know last time we kind of held on to them until the end, but we're going to address them right away. And we've got the poll there. Is it showing up? Do people see the poll? Okay, looks like people can see them. All right. So have people voted? Should American Jews be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut, Israeli Independence Day? In the context for this is actually a lot larger than that. We talk a lot about the divide between our two communities, the American Jewish community and the Israeli community, a divide that's growing because of a lot of the political developments, because of Trump and Netanyahu, who are very popular in Israel and who are not very popular in the American Jewish community. So it's really a very weighted question and a very weighted topic. And So while you guys are voting in the poll, I'm going to actually turn to Joel and Ari and ask you, what do you think about this topic? So let's start with Ari. Why don't you tell us if you think American Jews should be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut and why?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here and to be celebrating with this community. We talked a little bit about, at our last debate, about how special our readership is and our community is. And that's true at times of celebration. It's true at times of communal difficulty. And it's true when we all ask the hard questions together, or the interesting questions. And I have to admit, when Batya first posed this question to Joel and I, my response was sort of, well, of course. And I'm so grateful to both of them that I still think that that's the case, but I hope I think it in a little bit more of a persuasive way. So thank you for deepening my own thought on this subject. So I think that celebrating Israeli Independence Day, Yom Haatzmaut, makes sense from both an American perspective and a Jewish perspective. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one. America. One of the wonderful things about this country is the promise that citizenship and identity is not a matter of faith. It's not a matter of taking a loyalty test beyond the requirements of basic citizenship. There are no bureaucrats or inquisitors to test one's ideology or one's sort of religious commitments at all. In fact, the great insight of America, going back to the melting pot and forward to our current valorization of diversity, is that America welcomes all. And not only does it welcome all partially, but it welcomes all fully, in the fullness of their identity and with whatever they brought with them to these shores. A mentor of mine, Ruth Weiss, puts it that in the case of America, it's not a question of dual loyalty, but of doubled loyalty. That the more commitments one has, the more causes and passions that one brings to bear, is only all the better. Only creates a citizenry that's more diverse and more interesting. And we see that in the streets of New York City, and I hope we can see it soon, where we have parades celebrating every flag under the sun. And when those parades go by, whether they're Dominican or West Indian or Irish or gay, or the Israeli Day Parade, what's being celebrated is not nationalism in a narrow sense, but the whole bundle of identity that comes under a flag of language and culture and food and sensibility. And so I would posit that the celebration of a holiday not native to these shores is squarely in the American tradition of celebration of diversity and of diversity on a group scale, not only an individual scale. Now, as Jews, the Jewish calendar is thousands of years old, and Jews took it with them to whatever land they happened to wander in. And the calendar is structured and highlighted by events of national importance, of the liberation of from slavery in Egypt, of the giving of the Torah, of the law at Mount Sinai and Shavuot, which we'll celebrate in a few weeks, and then a whole other set of holidays, the rededication of the temple at Hanukkah that many might be familiar with, or the escape from persecution and genocide in present-day Iran, ancient Persia, that we celebrate on the festive holiday of Purim. And so this is what Jews do, is they remember their history and they make that history live. They activate that history in the present by celebrating holidays. It's what every country does, just as every July 4th we think of the ratification of the Constitution, and French Americans or French anything celebrate Bastille Day just 10 days later. The life of a nation lives in its holidays. And fast forwarding to the 20th century, I would posit that there is no greater tragedy in the history of the Jewish people than the Holocaust. And there might not be any greater miracle than the establishment of a state just 5 years after the ovens at Auschwitz stopped burning. And so the scale of those events, the sheer improbability of them, the horror of them and the joy of them, I think are biblical in nature. And the notion that we live in a time that continues to be touched by the prophetic, that requires memorialization, is evident to me. And just one last point, the notion of celebrating Israeli Independence Day, I think, requires no commitment to a specific set of Israeli policies, nor a commitment to a specific Israeli government. It requires merely the acknowledgement that something stupendous happened 72 years ago, that a people for 2,000 years asked for something, finally got it, no matter how imperfectly and how unfortunately belatedly. And so I think that celebration of Yom Haatzmaut, of Israeli Independence Day, is well-founded in the American idea and deeply rooted in the Jewish heart and the Jewish soul. And so for that reason, I raise a gold star, l'chaim. Enjoy.
Thanks, Ari. So Ari just took us through his argument about why American Jews should definitely celebrate Yom Haatzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. And now we're going to hear from Joel about why American Jews should not be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut. And then we're going to take a look at what you guys had to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Batya for organizing this panel. Thank you to Ari for being, as always, a worthy sparring partner. Thank you to all of you who are here. And I want to start off perhaps somewhat incongruously by, wishing those of you who are celebrating Yom Haatzmaut tomorrow, or rather tonight, a happy Israeli Independence Day. And I want to wish you a wonderful celebration if that is important to you, and if you have chosen to celebrate that in whatever way you may choose to celebrate it. Because my position, despite what some may think, is not actually that American Jews should not be permitted to celebrate Yom Haatzmaut, that it should be banished from the face of the earth, or that it shouldn't be part of our vast panoply of holidays that we have the ability to pick and choose from, for those people who find personal meaning and who find political and cultural significance in this holiday. For those who want to celebrate Yom Haatzmaut, I absolutely affirm that. I support that. I think that I think that can and be and should be a valid part of your personal cultural identity if you find meaning in it. In the same way that a Jew of French ancestry might choose to celebrate Bastille Day. My problem is with the elevation of a modern national holiday that dates back only 72 years to the level of a religious holiday that would be listed on synagogue calendars alongside Shavuot in a few weeks, or alongside Pesach or Yom Kippur, or the whole array of other traditional religious Jewish holidays that structure our liturgical year. My problem is that Yom Haatzmaut, as a political holiday that celebrates a modern political event and not a historical moment in the life of the Jewish people, rather, or not a traditional mode of worship, or not anything that is rooted in any of our traditional texts, such as the Torah or the Talmud, or any other Jewish text of that sort, that it basically imposes a political litmus test for celebration in a way that no other holiday on the Jewish calendar imposes. You don't have to have particular politics to celebrate Pesach. People interpret the politics of Pesach in a whole array of ways. You don't have to have particular politics to celebrate the New Year on Rosh Hashanah. In order to celebrate Yom Haatzmaut, you have to have a political connection and affirmation of the existence of a 72-year-old modern state as a political entity. It's the only holiday on the Jewish calendar that requires a particular political litmus test in order to celebrate it. And some might say that celebrating Yom Haatzmaut doesn't require political support for all of the policies of the state of Israel. It certainly doesn't require support for the Netanyahu government, or for Gantz, or any other Israeli politician that one might name, and that's fine. But be that as it may, it nonetheless requires you to affirm the establishment of a modern nation state 72 years ago as a significant moment in the life of the Jewish people. It requires support for a particular political program which, according to some estimates, as many as 1 in 5 American Jews don't actually subscribe to or support. So my problem is I want to push back a little bit on what Ari said about political pluralism and American Jewish identity, because I absolutely affirm that pluralism as part of the great promise of American culture. I often like to contrast this with French Jewish identity in the 19th century, that in order to get emancipated in France, the Jewish community under Napoleon had to agree that they would no longer assume a political identity as French people in the public sphere, that they would just be, the actual term was Frenchmen of the Israelite faith. They wouldn't identify themselves as Jews in a political sense. They would sort of push that all to the private sphere. And there are a whole array of other restrictions that the cultures and the places around the world that Jews have lived throughout the centuries of our exile have imposed on us. For instance, there were laws in the Russian Empire about where Jews could live and how Jews could identify politically. And to me, the great promise and potential of American Jewish identity and of American culture writ large, we have not always lived up to this promise, of course, but it's that being American and being American in conjunction with any other identity, whether that's Jewish or any other identity, Dominican, Native American, any other of the vast array of identities that one might name, does not require you to take a particular political position. And I think that putting Yom Haatzmaut as a religious holiday on the level of other Jewish cultural and religious holidays, such as Pesach, Yom Kippur, is actually a restriction of that pluralism, in that it requires subscription to a particular set of political ideals. It requires support for a particular nation state that not every American Jew supports, that we don't live in by definition by being American Jews, in order to celebrate it. And so I'm concerned that that kind of litmus test actually limits the pluralism and diversity of our community rather than expands and widens it. Again, for those within the community who find meaning in the holiday, I think that's wonderful and it should be celebrated. I'm not proposing any sort of ban on Yom Haatzmaut by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm concerned with elevating a political holiday to the level of a cultural standpoint. A culturally structuring holiday actually limits the great diversity that I think American Jewry at its best offers to the Jewish people, and that is really unique in our history. It's one of the only diaspora communities that has allowed such great expansive freedom of political opinions and political perspectives, while still allowing us to identify as both Jewish and American and not pick one or the other.
Thanks so much for that. So just a reminder, everybody, Joel and Ari have debated this at length in print, or I guess online, and that will be live at the Forward at 9 p.m. So you're getting a sneak peek of them hashing this out a little bit more in depth. So let's see if we could take a look at the poll numbers now and see how you all feel about this question about whether or not American Jews should be celebrating Israeli Independence Day. There was a poll earlier for people who have joined us later, and those poll results should be in, I believe. And we'll see how many of you agree with Ari that American Jews should be celebrating it, and how many agree with Joel and think that American Jews should not be celebrating it. So the overwhelming majority of you believe, 87%. Can you all see that? Can everybody see the results here? 87% of you believe American Jews should be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut, and 13% have said no and agree with Joel. What do you guys think of those numbers?
I have nowhere to go but down. Position to be in, right? But if I can briefly just respond to a couple of points, and then we'd love to hear what everyone has to say. You know, I think your point is well taken, Joel, and I think the struggle to figure out how to celebrate Yom Haatzmaut is one of the most interesting things about the holiday. It wasn't clear initially what its sort of religious valence was. It still isn't. You can go to a variety of synagogues, and some will have a deep liturgical commemoration. Others, maybe they'll serve some falafel and hummus and play some Israeli music. So I think there is a range. An essay I've always loved is by the great Rabbi and Talmudist Joseph Soloveitchik, called Kol Dodi Dofek, which means the kind of a knock at the door, but more heartfelt than that. And it comes from the Song of Songs. And Rabbi Soloveitchik's idea, and he came from a family viciously opposed to Zionism, dating back to the 19th century. And he broke with his world and his family. And his sense was just that the urgency of history was too great. The idea of having lived through the Shoah and lived into the 40s and into the 50s was just, some response was necessary, some sense that this mattered, that in the life of a people that dates over 3 millennia, the events that transpired were so earth-shattering as to require a religious response. Now, I think this question of what it means for a response to be religious when Judaism is, in one of its dimensions, a religion, is an interesting one. I think, most Israelis would, of course, see it as an event of prophetic import, but I think most would celebrate it, what I think we would agree is purely politically, in the way we would celebrate the 4th of July. I think when you think about American Jews, now, the primary, and most Israelis would not go to synagogue on Yom Haatzmaut at all. Now, when we're thinking about American Jewry, how would American Jewry celebrate something in a way not mediated by a religious institution? That might be a sociological question, right? That the role of the synagogue in sort of the perpetuation of Jewish life means that celebration will migrate there, right? And that will become the arena where, that sort of gathering takes place. I just want to note that, nobody is saying that the celebration of Yom Haatzmaut is on par with the great holidays of the Jewish year, of Passover, of Yom Kippur, of Rosh Hashanah. I think the sense is that the Jewish imagination and Jewish practice allows room for a kind of second tier of holidays. Things like the celebration of the new month every month, Rosh Chodesh, that you might not even notice, but has a little bit of like a liturgical boost. And sort of the celebration, I think, of Yom Haatzmaut is in that vein, if at its most, is a sort of sense of celebration, a sense of reading verses of Thanksgiving, but nobody would claim that it is of a level of, of Passover. And the law reflects that. There's no normative regulation of what one is to do or not do on Yom Haatzmaut as there is with the rest of the Jewish calendar.
So Ari, it sounds like what you're saying is that that Yom Haatzmaut being celebrated by American Jews kind of accesses the weird, ambivalent nature of Judaism, which is that it's kind of a religion, it's kind of a nationality, it's kind of an ethnicity, it has a political dimension, it has all of these pieces to it. And I don't think actually Joel would disagree with that. Actually, Joel, I want to read you a comment that just came in from Eliana Zisman. She says, Mr. Swanson, I don't think your argument is that celebrating Yom Haatzmaut is bad, but that celebrating Yom Haatzmaut shouldn't be treated as a religious mandate, and folks who don't celebrate it, I think, shouldn't be treated as bad Jews. Am I correct?
Yes, I think that's a very well stated summary of my point. It's a little more nuanced than that we should or shouldn't celebrate Yom Haatzmaut for sure. But just to respond very briefly to what Ari said, and then we'll get to some questions from the attendees, which is way more interesting. I absolutely agree with you, Ari, that Judaism and Jewish identity and Jewishness encompasses a whole range of expressions and identities, from culture to ethnicity to religion, and that it's hard to classify it under any of those categories in full. I'm always uncomfortable when people in the United States try to say that Jewish identity is just a religion, because for most of history, it hasn't been seen that way. But for me, that pluralism and that diversity should lead us to a whole array of possible political and religious and ethnic celebrations that'll encompass the whole range of celebrations of what Jewishness and Judaism have meant throughout history. And Yom Haatzmaut being elevated to the level of a holiday that is celebrated in the synagogue when, the Jewish labor holidays that the Jewish Bund in Poland came up with for its, cultural expressions of Jewishness don't, for the most part, have that status, seems to me to actually restrict what the full expression of what Jewishness means that you so well elucidated. And for those for whom the state of Israel is an important part of their Jewishness, it's fine for that to be an expression of your personal Jewish identity. My problem is when that's elevated above other expressions of Jewishness, particularly for those of us who have chosen not to live in the state of Israel.
So Joel, I just want to read out exactly on that point, Judith Bloom's point. She would like to ask Joel to comment about the fact that all holidays we celebrate were established at some point less than 2,000 years after they occurred. Why does the establishment of Israel as a refuge for those who survived the Shoah and persecution in other lands, why should it not be celebrated? And she wants to point out that she agrees with Joel, that she does not agree with the position of the current Israeli government, and probably Ari, I think, would agree with that as well. So Joel, why don't you take that on? And then I have a question here for Ari as well.
Sure. So if the question is, should we celebrate holidays that are more recent than 2,000 years old? Of course. There's a whole, you go back 2,000 years ago and the Jewish calendar would have looked very different than it does now, obviously. And the holidays that would have been the same, the way that they were celebrated probably look very different from what we do now. I don't dispute that. And the sheer fact of the recency of it isn't so much my concern. My concern is that it is a holiday that requires you to subscribe to a particular political ideal, the support for a nation state in the historical land of Israel, Palestine, whatever you choose to call it, that calls itself the Jewish state and that claims to speak for the Jewish people worldwide. Whether it actually does or doesn't is a topic for a whole separate debate that we could get into for hours longer. That my problem is not that it's more recent than thousands of years old, that it's 72 years old. My problem is that it's a holiday for a particular political event that requires you to take a particular position in order to celebrate it. And again, for those who take that position, they should by all means celebrate it. But
isn't that true of Hanukkah as well, though?
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I think and this just might be a point of core disagreement, which might be helpful to point out for our listeners, and I think refers us all back to a previous debate we did about Zionism, which I think is in the background here. I think of the celebration of Yom Haatzmaut as a big tent event. I think it pitches a tent that includes everybody from Naftali Bennett to Benny Gantz to the socialists who founded Dagania. To me, it sinks into the core Jewish pattern of yearning for a homeland and return to a homeland that structures almost every Jewish holiday in one way or another. And I think that's a pretty big framework for a lot of folks, no matter what they feel that homeland should look like or feel like or sound like, to fit in. Now, if the question is, if the establishment of that country is a political position, which I think is a fair take, Joel, I think that just might be a point of disagreement, right? I mean, is support for a Jewish state something divorced from Jewish tradition in every way, or is it somehow in dialogue with a holiday like Purim, which happened in the diaspora, right? And which featured, the Persian elite drinking from the cups and eating from the platters that had been despoiled from the temple in Jerusalem.
Right, but Ari, I think to be fair to Joel, Joel is arguing that this is a political holiday. You're saying it has other valences as well, but those don't negate the fact that you also have to subscribe to the particular political entity's existence as it is in order to celebrate this holiday, which is why I brought up Hanukkah, because it's a very similar Jewish nationalist holiday.
And maybe it might make sense to distinguish lowercase p politics and uppercase p politics. Right? And so I think I'm saying that the celebration of the restoration of Jewish self-determination after 2,000 years is big P politics, right? One that is reflected deeply in the Jewish calendric tradition.
Okay, so on that point, I want to read you a question from Ben Garger, who wants to know, what should Yom Haatzmaut even mean to American Jews? It's a very subtle question. What should it mean to us, Ari?
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I think, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, we are incredibly blessed to live at a moment when two great Jewish dreams have come true. The first great Jewish dream was security in the diaspora, a country, a politics, a regime where Jews could thrive on their own merit, where they didn't have to worry about persecution, where there was no oath necessary to and doctrines of another faith. And that, unfortunately, we're living with the resurgence of anti-Semitism, a perennial stain. But by and large, has happened in America. This is a wonderful place to live for Jews and many others, and minorities of all kinds. The second Jewish dream was a particularist dream. It was the dream that somehow, at some point, we were exiled and that we would return. And that dream found expression in prayer, in song, in literature, and in art, in every function of the human experience, and every kind of human expression. And that happened. That happened in the 20th century in a way that the prophets would have recognized. Not in the language they would have recognized, maybe not the politics they would have recognized, the small p politics, but the large P sense of Jews living in Jerusalem, of Jews living in the Galilee, that they would have recognized. And so to answer the question, I think it just means recognizing that we live at this extraordinary moment when we have this ability to choose, what dream do I want to live in? How many people get to choose between dreams? And how often were Jews just negotiating between different versions of a nightmare? And I just think that idea of living at a time when we're doubly blessed, whatever that looks like to you, whether that's saying a prayer, whether it's drinking a gold star, or whether it's dancing, or whatever that is, just that recognition. It's a vehicle for gratitude, I think, more than anything.
So you just answered David Finkelman's question, which was, why celebrate? Why not recognize, observe, honor? And I think what you're saying is it's all of the above. But I think sort of combining Ben's question, which I think a little bit is still on the table, with Alan Gale's point, what he says here is, yet Yom Haatzmaut and Yom HaShoah for many Jews have become more important than other Jewish holidays, as pride in Israel and Holocaust remembrance are for many Jews the main thing. That's kind of what I opened with. The thing that surprised me so much moving back here after living in Israel for a decade was how central Israel was to American Jews, to their Jewish identity. I wonder if you two could both talk about that. Joel, there's also a question here about where you got the number, if you could answer that 1 in 5 Jews are not Zionists. I know where you got it from because we had a kind of debate about that as well. So if you could respond to that, and then I would like you both to respond to what does it mean that Yom Haatzmaut and Yom HaShoah are somehow more central than Purim and Pesach and other religious holidays.
Joel, go ahead.
So very briefly, the number 1 in 5 American Jews who are not Zionists, we can work out whether they actually are or are not Zionists, and we tried to talk a little bit about that last week, and that's a whole other topic that we don't need to fully work out here. But briefly, where I got that from is a poll by the American Jewish Committee that asks American Jews, can Israel be both a Jewish state and a democracy? And if it cannot, which one should it be? 20% of respondents said it cannot be both and it should be a democracy and not a Jewish state. I take
Meaning that in the minimalist definition of what is a Zionist, if Zionism is merely the belief that planet Earth should contain a Jewish state, 20% of respondents said they don't think Israel can be both Jewish and democratic, and they would choose the democratic over the Jewish. So I sort of disagree with how Joel interprets those results, but that's the source for where he got that from. So now let's go to the second question, which I think really does get back to what does it mean for us? What does our Zionism mean to us? What does the centrality of Israel to the Jewish American experience mean?
So to respond to that briefly, which I think is a more significant point here, while I absolutely affirm Yom Haatzmaut as an important day for those Jews who find meaning in it, whether they're in the United States or Israel or Europe or anywhere else that Jews live on this earth, I am concerned that placing a national holiday for a country that American Jews by definition do not live in and have chosen not to live in. I think we need to emphasize the fact that that's a choice. By the very definition of the Israeli law of return, any Jew could live in Israel. We're not legally, none of us are legally forbidden from living there. We live in the United States because we choose to live in the United States and not to live in Israel, even though we have the legal right under Israeli law to live there and to become citizens. That it centers a form of identity that American Jews cannot fulfill. If you see the state of Israel and living in a Jewish state in the land as central to Jewish identity, or as a central way of expressing one's Jewishness, then by definition, Israeli Jews are going to be better at fulfilling that identity than American Jews. And I do think that centering the state of Israel as being defining of what it means to be Jewish for those of us who do not live there in some way makes us second-class Jews or defines us only in relation to an identity that we cannot fulfill. And I'm deeply concerned about what that says about our relationship to our own identity and how we understand our identity. But I also want to bring up, there was an interesting Pew poll taken in 2013 that asked American Jews what parts of their Jewish identity are most important to them. And 43% of American Jews named the state of Israel in 2013 as an essential part of Jewish identity. So that's a substantial percentage. No one would dispute that, but it's actually fewer than 50%. Whereas 73% of American Jews in this 2013 Pew poll named remembering the Shoah, the Holocaust, as central to Jewish identity. So we can—
That was the number one answer, but I think I find the number two answer even more interesting, which was that 69% said that leading an ethical life was the most essential thing, or one of the most essential things to their Jewish identity. And when you look at the Israelis, the number is much lower. It's not because Israelis are less ethical, it's because they don't associate that quality with being Jewish in the way that our community does.
Right, and far be it from me to say that there are right or wrong ways to be Jewish. In fact, what I'm arguing is that I don't want there to be any kind of restrictions on what it means to be Jewish, political or otherwise. But the idea that Israel is central to American Jewish identity, yes and no. Clearly, it plays a big role in the Jewish imagination, and a big role in our understanding of Jewish culture worldwide. But the majority of American Jews actually do not consider it essential to Jewish identity, which is interesting as well.
Mm-hmm. Ari, can you start by answering Joel's point about, well, if Israel is a central tenet of Jewish identity, doesn't that mean that living in the diaspora, you're kind of at one remove from an essential tenet, you know? And maybe tell us why you live here and not in Israel.
Yeah, Joel, I heard, I knew you were across on my screen and on my page, but who knew you were in my heart and my mind as well. I think there are worse things than hypocrisy. I think that they're worse sins than hypocrisy. And let me explain what I mean. I think you're absolutely right that marching in an Israeli Day parade or celebrating Yom Haatzmaut opens up a question, right? I spoke about the two Jewish dreams before, and you're absolutely right that the one element of that dream is the law of return, right? And the idea that any Jew in the world at any time can move to Israel, and that offer is standing and it's open. Of course we should feel that tension and or not, but it's there, and I want to acknowledge that. That to me doesn't seem like it means it's not worth doing. In fact, I want to feel that tension. I want to feel that pull. And I think Jews always have, right? There always was a diaspora. And in fact, the core holidays, the pilgrimage holidays, were always involved Jews from all over coming to Jerusalem, right? That's what the holiday was. And if everyone already lived in Jerusalem, they wouldn't have to go. But they had to make that trip, and then they went back. They went back to Babylon, or they went back to Rome, or they went back to Yemen, or they maybe even went back to Ethiopia, and they lived the rest of their year till it was time to go back to Jerusalem, right? And what do I know what was in their head on the way back, right? Do I know what they were thinking when they were riding their horse or riding? No, but I bet they were thinking a version of this question of where should I live and where do I belong? I think that another way to approach it is that sort of Israel has always played a large role regardless of where Jews lived. I saw a picture on Twitter just before I signed on here of Jews in 1948 under the Arch of Titus in Italy, celebrating with Israeli flags. And as many of our listeners will know, the reason why they were doing that was the Arch of Titus depicts the sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the exiling of the last Jewish commonwealth before the establishment of the state of Israel. Now, did those Roman Jews were they born in Israel? No. But history rhymed for them and history sang to them at that moment. And I think that I hear that and I feel that too. And so I think that, this question of diaspora in Israel, it's perennial. There's no right answer, but you keep hearing it. You keep listening and you do what you can and we're here and we're there. And, I'm in the West, my heart is in the East, wherever our bodies are. I'm here, you're there, you're on Zoom, I don't know. But geography's always been fungible that way.
If I could just very briefly respond to that, I do think it's important. Yom Haatzmaut celebrates the establishment of the modern nation state of Israel. And the idea that the land of Israel and yearning for a return from the land to the land of Israel and an end to the exile as a religious yearning, the relationship of that religious yearning that has long pre-existed the modern state is something that we could debate at great length on another occasion, perhaps. But the idea that I want to push back a little bit about the conflation of the sort of historical yearning for an end to the exile and the return to the land and the establishment of the modern state, because there is a whole branch of Orthodox Jewish thought that absolutely insists that we should separate them, that we should yearn for an end to the exile while not giving that sort of religious import to the modern state that was established in 1948. Whether you agree with that or not is a different question, but I do want to sort of tease apart the difference between land and state here, or at least potential difference.
Sure,
it's so funny. I feel sometimes like if the Satmar didn't exist, we would have had to invent them just for these debates. They provide such a useful foil because, of course, there are a lot of ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews who are anti-Zionist, who oppose celebrating Yom Haatzmaut. Ari, I want to pose to you a question by Brent Blyer. He says, it is disturbing and surprising that the N-word, Nakba, has yet to even be mentioned, 4 exclamation points. And I want to pose this to you as, should the looming threat of annexation that we keep hearing about, how does that influence this conversation? What are we supposed to do with that? We're used to sort of Israeli leaders behaving badly in recent years, but What is an American Jew supposed to do when a threat that is so noxious is posed, especially on a day like today?
Well, thank you, and thank you for that question. And I'm glad we're talking about that. Listen, I think that in a little bit of an analog to our discussion about Zionism is that I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with both celebrating Yom Haatzmaut and acknowledging suffering and displacement that was experienced by Palestinians. In fact, to me, they're a little bit connected, right? I mean, I think there's something deep and textured about saying that, and in a way very Jewish, that this is a deep moment of joy for me. But at the same time, like we break the glass at the wedding, right? Or at the same time that we read the plagues against the Egyptians, we drop little droplets of wine on the table and it stains, maybe the linen a little bit. I think there's something very powerful about that. What I don't think is right is the idea that this story is simple in the sense of, well, there was only catastrophe. That is something I cannot abide. I think a mature perspective would acknowledge both sides of this moment, right? That was a cataclysm and a sort of singularity of sorts, and this is where we are. On the annexation question, I would go back to my big P politics. I think it's, is there might there be a policy that revokes one's support for the very project of the state? I suppose it would be very hard for me to think of such a thing.
So annexation of the West Bank would not be such a thing for you? No.
Annexation of the Jewish area of the West Bank that will likely be part of Israel as part of a peace deal anyway, right? I think it's important to be specific, but I would just say that it's about first principles with Yom Haatzmaut. Should there be a state in the world that is a democracy, that enforces human rights, that allows for minority rights, where the Jewish self can be expressed in the public sphere? I think yes, and I think that's something to celebrate.
Now, Joel, I have a question for you. Isn't Israel the greatest miracle that happened to the Jews in a very long time, certainly since the Holocaust? And shouldn't we celebrate miracles in a quasi-religious way? This came from Chicago, this question.
I didn't write that, Joel.
I suppose the question of whether it's a miracle depends upon a lot of theological premises that we could debate at great length on a whole different matter. A lot of the founders of the modern state of Israel in 1948 did not want to believe in miracles in the supernatural sense at all. There are certainly a lot of the founders of the state of Israel were quite secular, if to use a problematic term in its own right, and didn't want to believe that this was in some way religiously miraculous. But I think to take the larger question, the question of whether this is a miracle in Jewish history, I think that depends on a particular interpretation of Jewish history that sort of sees Jewish history as being a moment of exile as being structured through cycles of living in the land of Israel millennia ago and then going into exile with the destruction of the temple and the miraculous return in 1948. And there are ways to understand Jewish history along those lines. And for those who understand it along those lines, then by all means, this could seem miraculous. But again, there's a whole range of ultra-Orthodox religious thought that doesn't see the establishment of the nation state of Israel as miraculous in that sense, because it wasn't accomplished by God and the return of Moshiach. And whether I agree with that or not, my concern is that elevating this modern political event to the level of a religious miracle requires a particular political perspective that not all Jews share, and that actually places limitations around the full expression of American Jewish identity. And again, for all those who want to celebrate it and who want to understand Jewish history in those terms, then by all means, they should. But I want to point out that there are whole ranges of Jewish religious thought, Orthodox and otherwise, that do not see the establishment of a human created nation state as miraculous, precisely because it did not come from God, from Elohim. And just briefly, if I could respond to what Ari's said about the Nakba point, which I think is important here and worth returning to. Ari, you want to push back against an understanding. I suspect that your position would be that if Palestinians and Palestinian Americans want to have other holidays that celebrate Palestinian identity and Palestinian history, that they should do that. I suspect that you would say that you wouldn't be against any celebration of Palestinian identity, but that the problem is defining it in zero-sum terms where we can only either celebrate the state of Israel or the Palestinian history and the Palestinian experience of dispossession and desire to return to their homes, that those are framed in opposition to one another. And if I could briefly respond to that, I think it's important to note that there's actually an Israeli law, famously called the Nakba law, that authorizes the Israeli finance minister to actually place fines on institutions that attempt to commemorate the Nakba in ways that the state finds problematic. They fine, and not just Palestinian entities, they actually fined a movie theater in Tel Aviv that had a Nakba film festival. So if you want to push back on ways of acknowledging Palestinian identity that set it in direct opposition to Israeli independence, that's coming from the Israeli government itself, which I think is important to acknowledge.
I'm going to respond to that by reading Jonathan Wolf's point, because I think it's relevant here too. Jonathan Wolf says, in response to Batya's last misguided question to Ari, what is an American who, like most of us, despises Trump and his policies to do on July 4th? This is Jonathan Wolf speaking. To paraphrase Ben-Gurion, celebrate America and Israel with all our hearts while simultaneously vigorously fighting Trump and Bibi and their terrible ideas, which are actually far less American and authentically Zionist than those of most American Jews, Jonathan Wolf says. We are loyal to both declarations of independence. Republicans and Likud betray those documents. So just noting that here, Joel, to say we should stay focused on our role here. What are our responsibilities? Because of course we don't vote in Israel.
Right. Well, just a couple of things, maybe to gather some threads, and then we can talk back out. One is, Jonathan, that it reminded me, I thought you were going to quote Ben-Gurion, his famous statement about fighting the British, right, during World War II, that we have to fight the British, right, as if there's no white paper, and fight the white paper as if there's no greater war going on. So, I think, I think that a focus on ideals, a focus on first principles, is the groundwork for subsequent debates about how we actualize those first principles, about what they.
Can I just ask you real quick? What do you say to Joel's point that there are segments of the American Jewish population who feel, let's say, offended maximally by the proposition that their Jewishness should be bound up in a political entity that they don't like and don't support? In your view, where the shul should have the Yom Haatzmaut celebration, where that should be a pillar of Jewish American identity, what do we say to those people? Are they just wrong? Do they need to just get with the program? What do you say about how do we deal? What do we owe that part of our community?
Listen, there are lots of reasons not to go to a shul. I mean, you might disagree with the liturgy. You might not like the rabbi. You might believe in separate seating. You might not believe in separate seating. So I fully support the right of people to be annoyed by the shul they don't go to. Like, that is a fundamental right. A Jewish
thing of all, being offended by something your shul does.
Right, exactly.
You don't go to does.
So I think, and listen, I think, certainly here in New York, I think we've seen the rise of more informal Jewish organizations that cater maybe more to people's frustrations with organized Jewish institutions, that bring together people who feel like their politics aren't represented in synagogues. It's no shock or news that the attendance and membership at the mainline liberal congregations in America is on the decline. And I think though most of those people, I think they're not stopping to go to those synagogues because of the politics of those synagogues. I think they're stopping because they want more politics somewhere else, but a different kind of politics, right? So I think that's an important distinction. It's not that there's this thing called, apolitical thing called Judaism, and Yom Haatzmaut is contaminating that by bringing in the political. It's that people want a kind of Jewish practice that reflects their politics fully, where maybe they're protesting, or maybe they're, I don't know, like doing work on behalf of anti-ICE demonstrations, or they're any cause, or they're, flyering for Bernie or whatever, right? So I think that people have every right to search out a kind of religious expression that, matches their politics, but there's nothing that's not political in that sense.
So Joel, I want you to respond to that, but first I want us to run the poll again. If you'll bear with me, I want you guys to take the poll again. We'll see if anybody changed their mind based on the last hour, what you heard here. So let's run that poll again, and I want you to vote. Do you think that American Jews should be celebrating Yom Haatzmaut? And while people are voting, Joel, why don't you go ahead, and I think you probably have something to say to what Ari just said.
Thank you. Ironically, I think this might be the moment where Ari and I have our most agreement, even in our disagreement. I absolutely agree with you, Ari, and affirm that there isn't such an idea as this apolitical entity called Judaism. Judaism and Jewish identity throughout history has always been bound up with politics, always been bound up with the politics of the places where Jews live, whether those are places where Jews have been a majority or not, as we are not in the United States today. The idea that Yom Haatzmaut is wrong because it brings politics into what is otherwise this pure, uncontaminated, apolitical space, I agree that that's not true at all, that Jewish identity is always bound up with expressions of understanding politics, understanding minority rights, understanding majority rights, understanding ways that the state relates to different religious groups. Absolutely. My problem is that by elevating Yom Haatzmaut as the only sort of modern political holiday that has a place on the Jewish liturgical calendar of most American synagogues, in ways that, the particular holidays of the Jewish Labor Bund, to take one example, do not have, actually restricts that full possibility for political expression in ways that actually takes us away from the ideal of Jewishness as being something that can be bound up in all sorts of political expressions. And that actually strikes me as a betrayal of the great promise of American Jewish identity, which is that we can be Jewish and American, and that doesn't require us to take any particular political perspective, but we can take whatever political position we want, and that doesn't have to limit us from being fully American and fully Jewish at the same time. For me, that's the great promise of the American Jewish experience. And it strikes me that elevating one modern political holiday, it seems to me that the Jewish community sort of putting its thumb on the scale in a way that actually limits that pluralism.
So there's a lot of questions here, Joel, about you personally. I just want to remind the participants that our emails are down below. Joel, I don't know if he wants to answer how he defines Judaism for himself, but he has generously supplied his email address. You can send him an email, follow up. Thank you everybody so much for coming. So let's take a look at the poll results and see if Joel changed any minds here. Joel, you got 1%. You got 1% higher. That's great. That's fantastic. You convinced one person. Look at that.
Yeah. If I could just a final thought, and then
let's eat. Why don't each of you give us a final comment to take away?
Right. I think I'll go back to the idea that for me, celebrating Israeli Independence Day is a big tent idea. The other 364 days of the calendar, we all can go back to caring about Israel or not caring about Israel, working on behalf of civil rights in Israel, working to end the occupation, working for Meretz, working for Likud, whatever you want to do. But I think just as the 4th of July is a moment to come together and to say, you know what, there's something bigger here. and taking a moment to just see that and acknowledge it and say thank you for it. And I think that the implications of a Jewish holiday at this moment in history, this late in history, are big enough that they're bigger than just our identities as American or Frenchmen or Argentinians or whatever, that they involve the Jewish people. More than half of the Jewish people actually live in Israel now in a way that transcends nationality, and that requires, a little bit of thanks and an acknowledgement and just engagement. Just stay involved, stay engaged. And I think Yom Haatzmaut is a way of saying, we're still here. It's an old people and a young project, and we'll see where it goes.
Joel?
Well, I'll start off my closing statement by, again, wishing people who are celebrating Yom Haatzmaut a happy Israeli Independence Day, and hoping that you find meaning in it, whatever that means for you personally. Certainly, obviously, we can't do all of the Israeli Day parades that in New York that we might want this year, but I hope that you can find meaning in the celebration, as given the limitations this year, as best as you can. But I want to say that in conclusion that the idea that American Jews should be linking our identity to a nation where we do not choose to live. And again, I want to emphasize that's a choice not to live there. It's not that anyone is preventing us from living in Israel. Maybe right this minute it'd be hard to emigrate there, but broadly speaking, any of us could, by virtue of being Jewish, live in Israel, and we choose not to. Strikes me as a recognition that there is something significant in being in diaspora and in being, according to the famous words of Isaiah, a light unto the nations, and of being a Jewish presence outside of the land of Israel, and having a culture that doesn't define itself solely in relation to the state of Israel. And that doesn't require that you celebrate Yom Haatzmaut or not, within your understanding of what it means to be an American Jew, which again is a very capacious and wide category. But I do just want to affirm that by virtue of being an American Jewish newspaper, the Forward primarily writes to an audience of Jews who have chosen for personal reasons to see some significance in having a Jewish identity that isn't yoked to living in the state founded in 1948. And whatever that means to you in relation to that state, whatever that means to you politically, whatever that means to you culturally, is a topic for another day. But I think we are here in the United States as American Jews because we think that there is something significant about Jewishness that can't be fully delimited and fully linked to the state of Israel. We think that there's something significant about Jewishness that goes beyond a country that was founded in 1948, whatever your politics or understanding of your relationship to that country.
Yeah, when I try to explain to Israelis, why does it matter that there is an American Jewish community, right? That they sometimes struggle to understand that. Like, why does it matter? What is the significance of our choice to live here and not there? And in a way, I think the choice is very significant because in a way, we sort of represent the promise of a liberal democracy fulfilled, right? We represent the idea that you can be a minority in a country that cherishes you for your difference. And that is sort of the goal of Western civilization. And we embody that. And not every minority in America even has that privilege. So I think that, as a model for the world is extremely important beyond the sort of spiritual connotations of diaspora and our relationship to Israel. Thank you both so much. Thank you to such a great audience, such great questions. Guys, please keep coming. Jody Radorn has been doing so many Zooms. They're all fantastic. Keep engaging, keep reading the Forward, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, and Chag Sameach.
Read our the written version of this.
Yes.
More in depth and much more eloquent, I think.